For more on this, we are joined in studio by Joan Allison, who is the head of external engagement at the UNHCR Regional Bureau for Southern Africa, as well as Sandra B Zaca, who arrived in South Africa in 1995 as a refugee from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where civil war had broken out. And, well, of course, we'll get her story in a short while. Such a pleasure to have both of you here. Welcome. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. You know, I mean, it's lovely to have a conversation, but not a conversation about this, because when we're talking about numbers that just keep on getting higher, so now we've broken through 100 million, the first time ever a number has been reached like this. I mean, Joan, this is a crisis.
It's a crisis, and the 100 million is double what it was a decade ago. It's increasing. In fact, at the end of 2021, it was 90 million. In just 6 months, it increased to 100 million. Yeah. That's because of the situation in Ukraine, Afghanistan, and a lot of other crises in the world, including DRC and Mozambique in this region.
Yeah. Which is frightening in itself. I mean, to just think about how it has increased exponentially in just 1 year. I mean, just in this whole crisis of Ukraine, and like you're saying, I mean, what are we looking at in the Ukraine? What is the refugee? Because I know this was the biggest and fastest refugee crisis in Europe, in that area. But what are we looking at right now in terms of refugees from Ukraine?
We're looking at about a figure of about 5 million.
Okay.
The number continues to increase. The situation hasn't been resolved. This is what we're also facing in this region as well. We have conflict that's not resolved. And peace is really the answer to this situation, both in Europe and in other parts of the world, but also in this region as well.
Yeah. I mean, when we look at this region, and I'm going to look at figures from this region, because this is where we really want to focus and talk about a lot, because sometimes we find that our attention is diverted to bigger crises like what's happening in Ukraine, and we tend to forget what's happening right here on our doorstep with our neighbors, with everything that's happening on the continent. It is a huge number. But before we get there, I want to say a good morning to Sandra, who's here with us in studio, who has a story and an incredible story to tell. So let's go back. I mean, you were born in the DRC.
Yes, I was born in the DRC. I grew up there, had a wonderful life. And in the 1990s, the world was volatile with the war in Rwanda, and in the Congo, the uproar started, and my family had to flee. And we left the DRC and lived in Malawi in the refugee camp, which was in Dzaleka camp.
Yeah.
And then we had to leave that to come to South Africa in order to get educated and just begin life from scratch.
So when you left the DRC, what age were you?
I was 15.
Okay.
Well, when we arrived here, I was 15. So we traveled for 2 years. So I was 13 when we left.
Wow.
And missed 2 years of school in order to find safety. So it was really hard.
I mean, you were leading a normal life in the DRC, I imagine.
Yes.
It was fine, it was great, and then
Yes.
suddenly it just changed.
It changed overnight.
Was it literally overnight that it changed?
Overnight.
And you and your family just had to pick up and go
Yes.
and run.
Yes. It's funny how it starts. You can hear the rumbles that something is wrong, but you keep hoping that it will get better. Also, I was a child, and you were very sheltered by your parents from all the news. And then one day you wake up, your life has changed. Yeah. Everything you know doesn't exist. And you leave everything behind, every single thing that you have.
Yeah.
And I was the oldest of 5 children. And we just left with one bag and my family, and we fled for our lives.
Wow. And then from there, as you say, you got to Malawi. But how did you get to Malawi? I mean, we always talk about the journey, the steps that are taken, the journey, the battle to find safety. So you flee from the DRC, you get to Malawi. How? How do you do? You don't catch a flight.
No, not
what
at
do
all.
you do?
You cross borders illegally, literally illegally. Walking, going hungry, hoping that strangers will help you. You hide in the villages when the police or the local police find you. People would hide you and you pay them. It's amazing in the midst of struggle, the kindness of people. I think that's what always strikes me. Yeah. People are so kind, and you can always rely on that. And we really got through Malawi by the kindness of people, just helping us along the way. I remember when we got to crossing the borders, when we're coming on our way to South Africa, crossing the borders of Malawi into Mozambique. We walked for hours and hours and hours without food, without water, just strangers helping us, telling us where to go and how to get to places.
Yeah.
So it's hard.
And then arriving here in South Africa, so you spent time at Seleka refugee camp, which I have visited, and I
Yes.
mean, it's a refugee camp. I mean, there's,
Yes.
you know, there's not much there. There's really not much
No,
there.
there isn't.
You're lucky to have a shelter over your head, which is great.
Yes.
And the silence from bullets.
Yes.
And I think that is what I've gathered. Anybody going into a refugee camp, that is what you cherish.
Yes.
Is that you feel that, okay, I can sleep in silence.
That's
Not
it.
in comfort.
And you've got food.
Yeah, but in
Yes.
silence and food, which is a good thing.
Yes.
You come to South Africa. What was your welcome like in South Africa? What was the journey like here?
That was also very hard because you don't know where you're going. We had never been to South Africa before, and we didn't speak a word of English, not one word. So we arrived, again, kindness of people, people helping us, and we went, I remember this so clearly, we arrived at the Home Affairs on the 2nd of January 1996, and we were welcomed by this Pakistani man. He had the only reason I remember because he was wearing the Pakistani Duke thing. That's the only way I
Like a turban almost.
A turban
Yeah,
almost, yes.
yeah.
And he was so moved by our story that a family with 5 children, I was 15, my youngest brother was 3,
Oh, wow.
could not speak a word of English. And he was so moved by the story. And we were given asylum seeker papers, which I still have. I keep the record of everything. And then they told us to go find a place to stay. And we didn't have a place to stay. We went to the different agencies, and I'm always grateful. The African Muslim Agency in Durban gave us shelter, gave us food, and we began life from the ground up. And we went to school. I had to teach myself how to speak English, starting from scratch with nothing, absolutely nothing. And here we are today.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about here we are today shortly because you have a great story to tell.
Yes.
In and amongst a very difficult past, but what you've created has been nothing short of a miracle. It
Yes.
really is, and we'll get to that. But Joan, I want to come back to you now because we hear one story from the DRC, and I mean, yes, we're looking at a beautiful Sandra sitting in front of us right now, but there's been, you know, this is a lucky story. There are not so many lucky stories. The conflict on the continent, I mean, when I read some of the things that have come out, and I'd rather leave it for you to tell us the problems that are facing this continent and how violence and wars are just escalating everywhere. Talk to us about this.
It's a very difficult, complex situation. I think the numbers speak for themselves, and what we see as globally increasing, but also in the DRC and Mozambique. And what we are concerned about is that DRC and Mozambique are also unforgotten crises, because we're overshadowed by the Ukraine, by the Afghanistan, by the Ethiopia's crises. Not to say they're not important, and we need to do more for them, but it's also to say we need to do more also for the unforgotten crises. The situations are not resolved. There are more internally displaced in this region, in fact. About 6.7 internally displaced people, the majority in DRC, and DRC also hosts the majority of the refugees and asylum seekers in this region. Sure. So 500,000 refugees. So inside DRC, which is a very big country, you have internally displaced, over 6 million, and 500,000, they're also host. The DRC is also host to refugees and asylum seekers. So the region itself are countries of asylum receiving refugees, but also, we can say, producing refugees. There are over 1 million refugees from the DRC.
Wow.
In the surrounding countries, and further afield also in Africa.
Yeah.
So the numbers are staggering. We don't see the numbers going down. UNHCR does what it can in terms of emergency assistance and asylum. This is the theme of this year's World Refugee Day, is safety, asylum, and protection. Because as Sandra said, the first thing you want is protection. Yeah. You want protection. That is, and then safety. And then the next step is not just to survive, like Sandra's story is, but to thrive. And this is where we work with governments, we work with partners, humanitarian and development, to look at opportunities to education, opportunities to work. Those are things that we are trying to do to resolve some of these problems. UNHCR is not going to resolve the conflict in this region or worldwide, but we will do what we can to at least protect and find solutions for those who are displaced.
Yeah, and that, of course, is the mandate of the UNHCR, an organization that was never really meant to be around for very long.
No.
I mean, and I'm not sure if people do know that I always found that very interesting about the UNHCR. This was perhaps you want to tell us a little bit about the formation of the UNHCR, and this was going to be a temporary structure, and then no one knew that this was actually going to be a permanent structure whose hands are so completely full because there are more and more refugees growing just uncontrollably.
Yes, UNHCR was started with in World War II to respond to the refugees from World War II, and it's a voluntary contributions. It doesn't receive contributions from the UN Secretariat, so it's voluntary. It's still a voluntary organization. So this is, the numbers we started off with a very small budget, very few people with refugees, but I think it's also what we're seeing with the Global Trends report that we issue every year on World Refugee Day, more and more people also internally displaced as well. So when we see people crossing borders to seek protection as a refugee or as an asylum seeker, there are equally a number of people displaced inside the country. So we're working also with internally displaced. That's also with other UN agencies. Cross borders is refugees and asylum seekers. There we work very closely with the governments to provide the protection. And more importantly, solutions. Solutions is where we're investing in. Solutions for those, as I said, it's more to, not just about surviving, it's about thriving and getting the opportunities to either to locally integrate, like the case of Sandra, where she has locally integrated into South Africa, or to go back. That is usually the solution that we're looking for. Most people don't choose to be a refugee. You never know when you're going to be a refugee. So most refugees do want to go back. They want to go back home. When they can go back, they will go back.
Indeed.
So
And that's, I mean, that's the ideal of anybody, isn't it? Is to go back to the place that you call home. So, Sandra, you arrive in South Africa. Let's get back to your story.
Yes.
You, as you say, you teach yourself English, you go to school, you find help. But what was it like integrating into society? Because it isn't easy trying to come into a new country and call this home. Can you call South Africa home now? Do you feel like it's your home?
Not yet.
Still
Funny
not.
enough, still not. I'm married to a South African. I am a South African citizen now. My children are South African, but I still feel not South African, if I can say that. It was really hard. I was just joking with the makeup artist. My husband is Zulu, so you will understand and appreciate the joke. I said to her, the Zulus think that they run the world. Like when you're in Durban, you arrive and you don't speak Zulu and people look at you like, what is wrong with you? I'm like, do you realize that the world is really bigger than that? So it was really, really hard. The xenophobia, that was really hard to deal with. Still hard. To deal with, because you don't get past that. It's like racism. It's an attack on you personally, because also people don't know your story, and also nobody chooses to leave their home. I did not choose to leave everything I know and love to just come here and take over. I have had to work hard for everything that I have. Every single thing. Nothing was handed down to me. We didn't have papers. Initially, I couldn't open a bank account or have a driver's license, just the basic things. So I've had to fight and work for everything.
For every little piece of paper.
Absolutely.
Everything you've got has been the biggest fight. Have you ever gone back to DRC?
No, not
Never.
yet. Not yet.
You say not yet. You
not
are
yet.
open to going back and visiting?
Yes,
or?
absolutely. I'm ready now. And also, we don't talk about the traumatic aspect of being a refugee. It's very, very traumatic. And until you deal with the trauma, you can't go back when you're not ready for it. And I think I'm ready now.
Your parents, are they still
Yes,
around?
my parents
Both
are
of
still
them?
around.
Yeah.
Both of them, they're my heroes. You know, for me, if they did not leave the refugee camp, imagine a 16, 20-year-old without education. My parents realized this child is turning 16 and she needs to get educated. They left, they risked their lives, all of our lives, so we could get an education. I finished matric, I was 20 years old. I was the oldest girl in school. I was 20 years old, but I finished school knowing how to read and speak and write English because I put in the work. And I think most people don't realize how much work it takes to just rebuild your life and also assimilating, because when you arrive here, you have to assimilate to a point where you don't even remember where you come from in order to just make a life. And then after assimilating, you have to remember where you came from. It's a difficult, it's so nuanced to be a refugee. You want to fit in, but you never quite fit in. And right now, I would be amongst Congolese people, they'll be like, you're not really Congolese, so you really never fit in. You're not South African enough, and you're not Congolese enough. You're just
existing.
Yes.
You're just Sandra, which is not a bad thing, because Sandra has done so well.
Yes.
I mean, you even got to the point where you were a finalist in Mrs. South Africa.
Yes, that was fun.
Come on, standing on stages and speaking, because that's also something that you do. You tell your story. People are listening to you, and you're hopefully, not hopefully, you are. I can promise you there are a whole bunch of people that are watching you right now that are looking at you as a role model. And strength and fight, because we've all got it in us, but you need to use the fight, which you are.
Yes, and I speak on resilience. I run a company called Brave Spaces, and I also run something called Brave Circle, where I help women that have been sexually abused to kind of get their life back, because I'm a sexual abuse survivor. And so I help women to just find their voice back and to be able to stand on their 2 feet and to change the mind. That's why I call myself a mindset strategist, because when you can help someone figure out how to change their mind and get them to see things differently, they can do anything. Nothing is literally impossible. I don't believe in impossibilities. I think you can do anything if you set your mind to it.
Yeah, indeed. But the one thing, and Joan, perhaps we can talk on this, is also asylum fatigue, refugee fatigue. We are in a country right now, and I speak for the world, because I think the world is in a very difficult position. We're sitting on the brink of a global recession, if not already in this. We're seeing prices going through the ceiling, job offerings are getting lower and lower and lower, and the locals, and I look at South Africans who are desperate, rampant unemployment. It's just the way it is, and yet we've still got to find within our hearts the ability to give and help others. How? What do we tell? What is the message we give to people that are desperate, but yet we still have to give of that small little pie?
Stories like this, stories like Sandra, who bring something to the country where they're a refugee. They bring inspiration, they bring skills, they bring talent. Refugees make a big contribution to wherever they are. But they need to be given the opportunity to do that. South Africa gave Sandra the opportunity, gave her education, gave her a space to be safe and to explore her talent and to explore. So education is absolutely key. And most of the refugees, their parents, the children, want education. And we often say this is, for us, one of the major protection tools for refugees. First, access to safety, to asylum. Secondly, documentation. It doesn't matter if you're in a refugee camp or you're in urban population in South Africa where there are no camps. I think anybody in South Africa or abroad knows the value of an ID, identification. You can't go to school, you can't get a job, you can't open a bank account. These are the basic things that you need. So these are the things we do, the basics. But it's also, I think the governments, the private sector, the role of civil society is quite amazing in this region, in South Africa and this region. They have a very strong voice. They're supporting refugees, supporting asylum seekers. So it's the role of many different actors together to bring that voice, to show what refugees can do, what they contribute, what they can do. But also, I think it's important to say they've also been traumatized. They are the most vulnerable of the vulnerable. Absolutely. And this is UNHCR, with its resources, prioritizes the most vulnerable population.
Best way to describe it, the most vulnerable. In terms of, just finally, when we look at the continent, particularly DRC, Mozambique, is there an end to the crisis there? Do we foresee something hopeful coming out of these countries?
I think not in the near future. I was just in Mozambique, which is a country that has conflict now with non-state armed groups, but also is hit by climate change. So I was there actually to see the impact of Cyclone Gombe on the refugee settlement there, but also on the Mozambican population. Devastated. 80% of the refugee shelters were devastated in their settlement there. So there is a lot to be done. I don't see conflict changing anytime soon, only if the governments are willing to have peace. Those who are party to the conflict want to have peace.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Joan. Thanks very, very much for talking to us. And Sandra, thank you for coming in and sharing your story as well, which I think is so highly vital that we share these stories. I mean, we woke up this morning and the two top trending topics that I see there were Ethiopians, and this is very much so, you know, talking against Ethiopians bringing here, looking at the Johannesburg CBD, the influx of foreign nationals and people just not wanting foreigners in South Africa. How does that make you feel? I'm going to actually leave that word with you. When you look at that, and yes, there are illegal immigrants, but those that are desperately here, asylum seekers, refugees, that category of person that's here, I mean, how does it make you feel hearing things like that?
It's very hard, but it also is what it is. But also remember that tomorrow South Africans could be refugees. You never know. Nobody chooses to be a refugee. The Ukraine, a year ago, if you had told them there will be refugees, they wouldn't have believed you. That could be us, and I hope it's not. But just remember that we all just want safety, food, and shelter. We all want the same things. And give us a chance. Give us a chance to just prove you right, that we're just human beings who want the best for their children.
Sandra, such a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for talking to us. That was Joan Allison, who is the head of external engagement at the UNHCR Regional Bureau for Southern Africa, as well as Sandra B Zaca, who arrived in South Africa in 1995 as a refugee from the DRC, where civil war had broken out, and has now made South Africa her home as much as she can.